Okay, like I mentioned at the end of the last lecture, we're starting with the end of the Romantic lecture because it actually fits in a little bit better with what we're doing lately, getting into the modern era, even though it's contemporary with some of the Romantic works we are looking at. So we're going to talk about photography, and photography is, for lack of a better word, more modern. So it's a good place to start um, as far as getting into modern art, like we're going to be doing. This is probably the earliest surviving photograph, and it doesn't look like much, but if you think about it, you can kind of see what's going on. Niepce, who's the photographer, took this by exposing a piece of um, a plate that was treated with a type of silver, same kind of silver that would be used in real film cameras today for black and white, and exposed it to the light outside of his window, and he's kind of looking out into a courtyard. So it doesn't look so great. It looks like some kind of like low resolution photograph, but it is the first photograph we know of. So people had known in various parts of the world that certain preparations of silver, when they're exposed to light, they change color depending on how long they're exposed to light. And a long time before this photograph was made, people realized that if you focus the light, like using a lens or something like that, that you could get an image of something. So when I talked about the camera obscura before, you could kind of use the camera obscura and use some treated silver like this. The problem is nobody knew how to stop the silver from going completely black when it continued to be exposed to light. And if you've ever had like silverware, like actual silverware, you see how it gets black if you don't polish it. It's the same idea. So what Niepce was able to do, he's able to do what modern photographers call stopping. In other words, he was able to stop the process of the silver reacting to the light and allowing you to fix, another word that photographers use nowadays, fix the image. So his view from his window at Le Gras, which is 1826, there may be actually a few earlier photographs than that. And he called it a heliograph, so literally drawing with the sun. And in a way, that's what he's doing. It's taking light and it exposes the things that are really bright. They turn black, and then the things that are lighter, they don't turn black. And then the things that are in between, you get grays in between. So when you use this method, you get basically a negative image. In modern photography, well, at least of the past like 100 years or so, as we'll see, then you take that negative and you print it again on another piece of paper, and you get the positive because everything switches because the silver is reacting in a different way. So this is probably the earliest photograph. And even though Niepce invented it, his invention, and we'll look at if you take my modern class that I teach in the winter, um, there's also another photographer who was working on the same thing, and neither of them really had an influence. So we'll kind of talk about who picked up this technology later on and how it influenced the types of things that we're going to see in photography and art in general later on. So this is Nadar. And Nadar, he took some of the photographs that we had already looked at in the Romantic period. This is his picture of Sarah Bernhardt, who at the time is just a kid, like a model, like a lot of young people who are actresses or doing other sorts of work would work as models to make some money for artists or whatnot. And in this case, she's working for Nadar and just doing this kind of standard model look. You can tell she's wearing basically a curtain, but he's going for a little bit of this classical feel like we had talked about before. The folds on this curtain make it look like it's something almost from ancient Greece. And then she's leaning on this column-like thing that looks like columns that you would see from ancient Greece. And presumably she's not wearing anything underneath. So again, like ancient Greece. So this says gelatin silver print. That just means photograph. So gelatin silver is the type of silver they use to react to the light. One of the things that's unusual about photography back then, that is not the case with photography, no matter even if it's digital photography nowadays, is there wasn't really lighting that you could use in a photography studio. Like there were stage lights, but those things were super hot. You couldn't be close to them. Um, and they didn't have like electric lights at the time that you could use. So how you would make a photo studio is you would basically have a room, and along the top of the room, you would have sliding panels, and this is what Nadar had. And depending on what time of the day was, you could let the light in, and you could let the light in from some panels and then block them off from others. And that way you could create these shadows. So you can see the light is all coming from the left side of the picture, her right, and kind of falling on her here. And when you do that, when you have the light coming from the side, it brings out the contrast. It brings out these folds. It brings out the qualities of her face and her hair. And a lot of times, photographers will also put a little bit of light behind the figure. That way there's a little bit of a shine around their head. And these sorts of techniques are still used today. So this is a little different. If you were trying to get a portrait before photography, it'd be pretty difficult to do because, you know, you'd have to pay someone to paint you. So most people would have no idea what their like relatives that have long passed look like, because most people couldn't afford to have a painting done. So photography started to change that. And this is the case with one of these things. Augustus Washington is a photographer, but he's just running a photo studio where you can walk in and pay a few dollars. In today's equivalent money, maybe that was like 5 cents back then or something. And you could get your photograph done, and they would process it and get it back to you. And this is new. Again, before this, if you are a regular person and you weren't elite, you weren't wealthy, and could, you know, commission someone to paint yourself, then you would have no images that would survive of you. So this is John Brown, who turned out to be famous later on. He organized with slaves for a slave uprising. So he's a very important person in the 19th century, a good example of what white people should do if they're serious about racism. And this is before all of that. And he's kind of showing how his idea of that everyone should be free and there shouldn't be slavery, that is kind of patriotic. So we can see that with the way he's looking. But the only reason he's captured is because of this new invention. And you can see that it says here, daguerreotype. So the daguerreotype was developed by a French inventor, well, sort of inventor, named Daguerre. And Daguerre actually worked in the theater. And his idea with developing photography from some of the people that he had saw that had already done it, like Niepce, was to try to create images for stage sets. So he was in charge of setting these stage sets for the theater. And they already had some pretty advanced things going on in stage sets in France in the 19th century. So he basically wanted to make it easier to create these huge backgrounds that they had. And so he worked on making photography so you could just photograph things, and he was hoping he would be able to like print it really big. That didn't turn out to happen. But he did come out with a process that was pretty cheap and easy to train people to do. And although he patented it, it didn't really last very long. And it ended up making its way all around the world. People would own these photo studios. So daguerreotypes are a little bit different than most of the photographs we're going to look at, and in a pretty important way. Daguerreotypes are taken on and viewed on the same surface. So this is kind of like a metallic surface, and I would actually load this into the camera, expose it, then use the chemicals to kind of stop the image. And what you would get would be the same image. The chemicals they used basically reversed it so that it looked like it was positive if you looked at it at just the right angle. If you see a daguerreotype in real life, and every once in a while you can see them in like antique stores or whatnot, when you turn them, they turn into a negative. And then when you see them at the right angle, the correct angle, not a right angle, at the correct angle, then you can see it as a positive. So it's kind of limited basically what goes into the camera is what comes out of the image. You can't really change anything once you've done it. But it does get an incredibly precise image. You can see it's 10 by 8 centimeters, so about 5 by 4 inches. And that surface is much bigger than the sensor, say, on your digital camera by 100 times. So you can get really precise imagery, really high resolution imagery, but you can't really change it. So what this is, it democratized imagery. It made it possible for everyone to be able to get an image of themselves or their families. But it wasn't as useful, this particular process, the daguerreotype process, for artists, because you couldn't change it once you took the photograph. But it was on. So it's kind of interesting the way that photography works today, because somebody had mentioned, I think it was in like 2018, that in the year 2018, there were hundreds of times more photographs that were produced than in the entire 19th century. So, or in a typical day in 2018, there are more images than were created, photographs were created in the entire 19th century. So this is definitely, photography is definitely democratized imagery, and we have a different view of imagery. But what artists like to do was use photographic techniques that used a negative. So you take the picture on a negative and then you print it again on paper. The reason why is because you can do a bunch of things to make changes to the image to make it more interesting, or to make the thing stick out of the image. Or in the case of this one by Gustave Le Gray, to be able to make the photograph look like you could see both the sky and the sea in the same picture. So if you've ever tried to take a picture like this, like you want to, if you're living in Michigan and you went to one of the lakes and you tried to take a picture, late in the day or early in the morning over the ocean, and tried to get a good, or over the, sorry, I'm from the East Coast, over the lake, and tried to get a good picture of the sky and the lake, usually can't get both. And the reason why is because cameras aren't as good as our eyes. Like, we can look out in the lake and we can see lots of detail in the lake, and we can see lots of detail in the sky and all the clouds. A camera isn't that dynamic. You can either get a good image of the lake and then the sky would be just totally white and you wouldn't be able to see anything, or you can get image of the sky and then the lake would be totally dark. And this is the same way if you've ever seen pictures that were taken of the Apollo missions on the moon. You may notice that you see the moon and you see the astronauts, but you don't see any stars in the sky. Whereas the astronauts, when they were standing there, they saw millions of stars. They saw all of the stars. And the reason why is because the light that was reflecting off the surface of the moon and off the astronauts' gear was much, much brighter than the stars in the sky. So the camera could only capture those things. It couldn't get all of the stars, even though to the astronauts who were actually there, the stars would have been incredible. So it's the same idea. So how photographers get out of this is, and I've done this myself, and your camera kind of simulates this if you have an iPhone or similar, when you use the HDR mode. So how I did this before HDR and how Le Gray did it is you put your camera on a tripod. You take one picture where the ocean looks good. So you kind of like make the exposure shorter, or make the aperture tinier so less light comes in, and or more light comes in. And then you do another one of the sky where that looks good. So you take down the exposure a lot so that the brightness doesn't get blown out. And then you take those two negatives and you expose one part, that's just the ocean on a piece of paper. And then you don't develop the piece of paper, and then take your other image that you had where the sky looks good, block off all the stuff you already exposed, and then expose the sky. And with something like this, where there's a horizon line, it's actually super easy. You basically have to get, when you print these kinds of photographs, you have a projector, and it projects your negative onto a paper. So what you would do is just make a cardboard cutout in this shape, And whenever you're exposing the sky, you would just cover this up so it doesn't get exposed to the light. The dark room's all dark, so that doesn't make a difference. And then you would do a cardboard cutout that cuts out the other end, and then you would expose your sky. So that's super easy, but it looks good. It's the only way that you can get these kind of images. So whenever you see an image like this, even with your camera, the HDR isn't quite able to simulate this. You can tell that it's two photographs. You can see already artists are like, they can do more. They can do what a painter does just by painting, except they're doing it with the light. So this is kind of an advanced version of this technique. And the thought of how many tries it must have taken to do this photograph could drive me insane, because this is multiple photographs. So like a painter, when they make a painting like this one, which is the one that was inspired by the School of Athens by Raphael, you can control the light. You can do whatever you want because you're just painting. You're not limited by what light's in front of you. So if you want to make someone slightly brighter or someone slightly darker, you can do that. You can have people stick out or not, and you can also control shadows. That's not the case with photography. You kind of have to deal with the space that you have, especially since at this time they didn't really have good studio lighting, so they couldn't really control it. So what Oscar Rielander did is took a bunch of different photographs, and you can sort of see where they are. So all of these figures, this is one photograph, that's one photograph, this is another photograph, this is a photograph. So there's, oh man, there's at least a dozen photographs in here, and then there's the background that's photographed as well. So what Rielander would have had to have done is basically make a cardboard cutout that is in the shape of each of these figures that he wanted to place in there and block off the rest of the photograph. So he'd expose the background first on the sheet of paper, and then he exposed each of these negatives. And each time you do this, you can't actually see what you're doing very well. So basically you would have to guess. And you can sort of make it so that the you figure out exactly how big the paper should be, but that takes a few tries. So, and then each part of the process, you can screw it up easily and have to start over. Like he could have gotten to the last figures he was going to put on there, and it was screwed up and would have to do the whole process over again. So it's not like Photoshop where you can just undo. And this is pretty good considering it's not Photoshop. But the reason why you want to do that is it's so you can control the light, so you can have certain kinds of shadows. You have some figures darker than the other. And even if you didn't originally photograph them as darker, you can just expose them when you make the print a little bit longer. So the negative and positive process enabled artists to do things, to change things like a painter would. So for a lot of artists, this was more like art. So this one is a super advanced and very well done version of this technique. This is by Henry Peach Robinson. And I think if you saw this at first and I said this is one photograph, and everybody was sitting here in this room exactly as they were, you wouldn't doubt me. But it is actually several photographs. So Henry Peach Robinson would actually make drawings the same way an artist would. And then he would try to get whatever he could in real life to take a photograph of that was close to the drawing. And then he would take separate photographs and arrange them on the page as he wanted. So if you look closely, you can kind of see how some of these images are separate. So our old man right here probably wasn't here in this room. The woman right here, she may have been, she may not have been. We can see how there's not a shadow falling on the baby right here, and there should be. This bowl, definitely a separate photograph. So in this way, photographers, by using this technique, they can kind of do things like painters do. And even when you look at the fire in the background, he probably kind of exposed a little bit of light extra to make the fire have this glow around everything. So with dawn and sunset, you get some of that symbolism with lights and darks like we had seen before, like especially in the Baroque period in Caravaggio, but you're doing it with real life things. So I'm not saying like nowadays when you do this with Photoshop, there's still an art to it and it's still kind of amazing. But it is amazing what people are able to do with a much more difficult process back in the day. So this is another example of what you can do with photography. Some of it is straight in the camera. Um, and then some of it is the way it's printed later on. So a lot of times you see album and print, it's just photography. It's just a different process. And it looks kind of brown. That's just because of age. When it was originally done, it wouldn't have been quite this brown. It would have been more black and white. But the artists were aware that it would look like this eventually. So it is kind of an appealing quality. So this is Julia Margaret Cameron. And she, in another life, probably would have just been a painter. And she had done some herself. But she got really into the new technology of photography and consciously tried to make art out of it. So with Daguerre, he was trying to do like a business type of thing. But we can see people like Robinson and Julia Margaret Cameron, they're trying to make art. So when I first showed this image, Sister Spirits, you could be like, okay, it's 3 women and 2 kids and a baby. But I think you can kind of tell by the way the women are dressed that they're going for these images like we saw in the Renaissance with Mary and Jesus and Mary's cousin Anna. And that's what she's going for. And just by picking these types of subjects, she's kind of showing that this is art. So in her Sister Spirits. The other thing she would do too is take advantage of a thing that lenses do. And that is depending on how much light you let in the lens and the length of the lens, you will get different things in focus and different things out of focus. And it's called depth of field. So if you wanted to take a picture of like a landscape or you wanted everything close and far to be in focus, then you would use a really small aperture. So a little tiny hole with the light coming in. If you want to take a picture like this with a narrow depth of field, meaning the only things that are in focus are the things that are on this plane. Things that are closer than that or farther away are out of focus. And that's called like a shallow depth of field. So she uses this depth of field to kind of like pick out parts of the image. So the baby's kind of out of focus, almost ghostly. But the 3 women here and the 1 kid who's kind of a little bit farther back are in focus. So depth of field is a way that they can use that you can kind of pick out things in a photograph that you want to emphasize. And if you've ever taken a school photograph, they usually also use a very shallow depth of field because it looks good on people's faces generally. So this one, this picture is kind of gruesome. It's exactly what it looks like. It's a bunch of dead bodies in a field. So there's a little bit of story to this. This is by Timothy O Sullivan, but it was at the behest of a businessman named Matthew Brady. So when the Civil War started in the United States, that's in 1860, if you're not aware, a lot of people thought that, white people, needless to say, a lot of people thought this is going to be a short war. It's going to be over in a bit, and everyone's going to be impressed by all this glorious fighting and raging for freedom and all this kind of stuff. But that's not how it turned out. The war ended up going on for 5 years. It was just with the new kind of technology that they came out with, military technology, it was extremely destructive. There was about 650,000 people that were killed. So a massive amount of death. I mean, 650,000 at a time when in the United States was far fewer people. So this was like an incredibly violent war. And afterwards, most people wanted to forget about it. And in the South, they really tried to do that, except to celebrate, racism, I guess. But after the war, people didn't really want to think about it anymore. And with photography, we saw some of these pictures with war where they tried to make it look glorious and sort of non-violent, and other ones where they showed the violence, like Goya. People didn't really want to see this stuff because photography can only show what's there, basically. And what's there is after this battle, and this is one of the worst battles in the entire war. It's in Gettysburg. And if you ever visited there, basically they kept the site of this battle exactly as it was back in the day. So it has a somewhat disturbing effect. I'm not a person that believes in ghosts, but you definitely feel like something bad had happened there. And a lot bad had happened. In 3 days, 25,000 people were killed in this very small area. Um, so Brady, before the war, he bought all this film technology because he thought, oh, everyone's going to want to celebrate it and see pictures, and I'm going to use this new technology. I'm going to get even richer. So, he hired a bunch of photographers and sent them out. And they said, go take pictures of battles. And they tried to do that, and you can't. If you know anything about 19th century warfare, the types of guns that they had they had lots of smoke. So as soon as the battle started, you can't see anything. This includes the soldiers themselves who are fighting. They can't see a thing either. So it's just smoke everywhere. And you can see in this picture was taken like a few days after the battle. There's still like kind of smoke all around. So you can't take pictures of the battle. And the photographers at that time didn't really have cameras that were fast enough to stop the battle anyway. So Brady just told everyone, we'll take pictures after the battle. And they were like, well, there's nothing there because, it'd just be an empty field, and then there'd be a bunch of people piled up inside of trenches. That's where most people would be killed in these cases. So he told his photographers, he's like, make something. So this is kind of gruesome, but these photographs, a lot of these men were dragged out of trenches because they would leave the bodies there for a while, because basically if your family didn't pick up your body, they might stay there for quite a long time, and drag some out to make a composition. A rather gruesome one. And you can see when you see these figures, there's nothing glorious about this. These men are super dead, and that's what we're seeing. But the kind of upside to this is that people like O Sullivan and other people that Brady hired were able to learn this new technology and to be able to use it in a bunch of different ways. And that enabled photographers to be able to work outside, to be able to do things in new ways that, because of all these problems they had to solve taking these sorts of pictures. For Brady, it didn't work out so well. He basically went bankrupt after the war because he couldn't sell any of these photographs. But I guess it's a good thing he did it, because we have all these photographic documents of the war. So that's it.